All right, everyone, it's 11:01. Welcome to the science webinar today for the month of October. I'm your host, Corey Oakley. If you don't know me, I am Assistant Chief of Inland Fisheries. And today we'll hear a talk on tricolored bats in North Carolina from Catherine Etchison, and she'll introduce herself about all that she does. So, Catherine, it's yours.
Thank you, Corey. Well, hey, everybody. Let me just get this up on my end. All right. Well, I'm excited to be here to talk to you all today about tricolored bats in North Carolina. I am a wildlife diversity biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and I work with bats statewide. So this is something near and dear to my heart, something I work on a whole lot. I've got to preface this up front by saying I'm recovering from COVID, so just bear with me if I'm a little bit congested or hoarse or have to stop and catch my breath here and there. But we're still going to have fun. So let's just jump right in. First, I want to just talk about some basic information about this species. So the tricolored bat's scientific name is Perimyotis subflavus. This is one of our smallest bats in North America. And then in North Carolina specifically, it's one of the two smallest bats that we have. The other one being the eastern small-footed bat, just in case you're curious. And the tricolored bat is one that will typically hibernate in the wintertime. So in our group of bats, we have some that hibernate and some that just leave an area completely in the wintertime when it gets too cold for insects to be active. And tricolored bats are one that will typically hibernate, but this totally depends on its location and what the winter is like there. So this will come into play later on when we talk about kind of what's going on regionally within our state. And then as far as hibernation goes, they are typically the first species to go into a hibernaculum for the winter. And a hibernaculum is just simply a place where an animal hibernates. For bats, that tends to be caves and underground abandoned mines. And then they're the last to leave in the spring. So they're usually in hibernation for longer than any other species that we have. And this has some bearing on their survival, which we'll get into a little bit later. And we know of them in the literature to be a regional migrant from their summer grounds to their winter grounds, but really there's so little data on this that we're really limited in what we know about how far they'll travel. So that's just something that we still have questions about. Some more basic information about this bat. In the warmer months of the year, so not the time when they'd be hibernating, we tend to see them roosting during the day in dead leaves of deciduous trees. So basically clusters of dead leaves is what they'll roost in, and especially oak trees. And if you look at their fur coloration, that makes sense. They'd be pretty well camouflaged. Now, they don't have to necessarily use oaks. They can use sort of any deciduous trees that's got some clusters of dead leaves in it. And they even can use pine trees as well, where clusters of leaves have kind of blown in and gotten stuck. They'll roost in those. They'll even roost in dead clusters of pine needles as well. So like many of our bats, they're pretty flexible. They don't abide by really hard and fast rules. So just keep that in mind. And they'll also roost in human-made or artificial structures as well. They don't necessarily have to roost in trees alone. And so we can find them in bridges and culverts and even old buildings. They tend not to be a species you would see in a bat house like some other bat species that we have in the state. And they tend not to be one that would get into a small crack or crevice in a relatively modern house, into the attic or something like that, like some of our other bats will do. And this species will form maternity colonies. And so a maternity colony is just a group of female bats, usually pregnant female bats. They'll group up together and roost together, usually starting in the spring, and they'll roost together through that reproductive period until they've had their pups and nurse their pups until they've weaned them. And the colony usually breaks up once all the pups can fly, and they'll kind of go their separate ways. A lot of bat species will form these maternity maternity colonies, and some species, they will be very, very large. So they could be hundreds or thousands of individuals, but tricolors are not one of those. They are going to form very small maternity colonies, usually less than 10 bats, could be maybe up to 20 bats, but we don't see a lot of records of that in North Carolina. But they also can just roost individually with their pups as well. So pretty small colonies for this species. And the litter size tends to be 2 pups per female. We also find this species being tied to riparian areas a lot of times. They're typically going to forage over lakes and rivers and ponds, and they'll also really key in on edge habitat. Forest edges specifically tend to be a hot spot to find this species. So you may have heard more about the tricolored bat lately because of a proposed listing from a year ago. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced the proposal to list this species as endangered back in September of 2022. And we should hear some sort of final word on that in the coming months, probably before the first of the year or around about that time. And this is due to white nose syndrome associated population declines, which has been a really significant impact on this species. So we'll just jump right into talking about white nose syndrome and get into what's going on with that. This is a fungal disease that's native to Europe and Asia, and it's caused by the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or just abbreviated PD from here on out for the presentation. And this is a psychrophilic fungus. So this grows in, it means it grows in cold conditions, is a cold-loving fungus. So it grows in a pretty narrow range of cold temperatures that have to be consistently a cold temperature. And it also grows in humid and dark conditions. And so if you picture yourself inside a cave or an underground mine, that's exactly what you would experience. Consistently cool temperatures, dark and humid. And so this is where we find this fungus. And this disease is causing a mass mortality of hibernating bats. And the way that this plays out is when bats are hibernating, that's the key here, they get their body temperatures to within 1 degree of that ambient temperature in the cave. And that allows this fungus to grow on their bodies. If they weren't in hibernation, it couldn't grow on them. They'd simply be too warm, just like it can't grow on us. But the hibernation part facilitates that. And so when they're hibernating and this fungus is growing on them, it just irritates their skin so much that they wake up out of hibernation, they clean themselves off. And the problem with that is it's very energetically expensive, and they've got a finite amount of fat reserves to last the entire winter. And what usually happens is they just starve to death from repeat awakenings before spring has arrived and insects are plentiful enough for them to build back up their fat stores. And so typically that is what happens, unfortunately. And with tricolored bats, it's a little severe, or a little more severe than for certain species, because they have a very long hibernation, like we talked about. When they're the first one into the cave, they're the last one out. That gives them a lower likelihood of survival because they've just got to endure that disease for so long. And then their smaller body size also gives them a lower likelihood of survival. There's been some research that shows that the larger an individual is, the better chance they have of survival with white nose, because they have more fat stores to work off of. And so they can get away with waking up frequently and cleaning themselves off. And we've had white nose syndrome here in North Carolina since 2011. So this is just a map showing where all we have either found PD or diagnostic symptoms of white nose syndrome in bats. And so the solid red is where we have found it, and then the stripy red counties are where we haven't found the disease because we don't have a cave or mine to actually survey in those counties that we know of. And that's how we find the fungus and the disease. But we see population declines that are just the same as in the neighboring counties. And so we think, yeah, it's definitely there. We just don't know where it's there. We're always looking for more caves and mines to survey. So that would help us be able to kind of fill in some of those gaps a little bit. But we really think we have white nose throughout the mountain region in the state. And then we also have seen either evidence of the disease, meaning the fungus, or symptoms of the disease also in 7 Piedmont counties at this point. No coastal plain counties, so that's good news. And then this is where we have tricolored bats in the state. So really pretty much statewide. In our database, we have 75 counties with records of tricolored bats. They really could be in all 100 counties. And then on the right there, you can see the range in the US for this species. They're really an eastern to Midwestern US bat, and they do range up into Canada. It's just not on this map. So when we think about how tricolored bats are doing in North Carolina, it's really hard to just give a broad overview of the whole state because it's very different throughout the 3 regions of the state. And so the reason for that is really our population trends and the extent of monitoring that we've done historically is really different between the mountains, Piedmont, and coastal plain. Also, the extent of white nose is very different, and how white nose is behaving is different as well because the winters are different. So it's complicated. So we're going to go just region by region, and I'll give a summary of what's going on and then a highlight from each of these 3 regions. And so we'll start with the mountains and we'll work our way east. So in the mountains, this is where we have our longest term data set. So we have extensive long-term monitoring data. Many of our sites have at least 10 years worth of data. A lot of them have more than that. It's kind of exactly what you want to understand how bats are doing. And the reason we have that is because this is where most of the state's caves and mines are. And so we have most of our hibernating bats here, and they're easier to survey when they're hibernating. And that gives us a good indication of how they're doing. And so we've had a lot of surveys in caves and mines for many, many years. We also historically had our federally listed bats up here in the mountains before white nose came and made us list more species. But the Indiana bat and the gray bat, they've been listed since the 1960s and 70s, and they are up here in the mountains. And so historically, presence and absence surveys for those bats were done in the mountains and got a lot of data for other bat species along the way. So we just have these great long-term data sets. So we have 3 population monitoring programs that pretty reliably detect tricolored bats. I'm going to give some trends from 2 of those today. So the first one being our hibernacula data set. So every winter we go into caves and mines and we count all the bats that we see. This is a great tool to get some population monitoring data because bats are really faithful to those caves and mines. They go to the same ones every winter. So that just allows us to really keep tabs and see how they're doing. Because if we go one year and there's 100 bats, and the next year we go, usually every other year, we try not to go every year, and say there were 80 bats, we would know, okay, 20 bats probably didn't make it because they probably would have been here. So it's just a really good tool for us. What we have here is just our number of tricolored bats that were counted each winter from 2010 up till this winter. And you can see in 2010, there were close to 5,000 bats counted that winter. And then the next winter is when white nose syndrome was found in the state, 2011. And then a really, really steep decline all the way until 2015. And that line started leveling off then at a really low number, but not 0, until about 2020. And 2020, we saw an uptick in our count that winter. It was probably the only good thing that happened in 2020. And we were hopeful that maybe that line had changed its orientation, for now on. Like, we might continue to see an increase in counts, but that was not the case in 2022 when we resumed our surveys. In 2021, we took off because of COVID. We saw just a continuation of what we had seen in the years right before 2020. So not a continued climb in the counts, but then this winter we saw that again. And so I'm hopeful as we continue to do these surveys that maybe we'll continue to see those really small increases. Overall, though, it's been a 95% decline in these tricolored bat winter counts in the mountains over 14 years. Like I said, starting to see small increase in counts. Hopeful that that continues. At this winter, we had a 50% increase at our sites overall. And I should say, like, 50% sounds really great, and it is great, but keep in mind, these are really low counts. You know, we're going into caves and mines and seeing like 10 bats in this one and 12 bats in that one. So we have a long way to go to climb back up to what we previously had before white nose. So I just want to share from another monitoring program. This is an acoustic monitoring program that we have. So we have a statewide program now, but it at first it just grew out of just a mountain regional program that started in 2011. And that's what I'm going to share this from, because our data sort of changed, our sites sort of changed once we went statewide. So this was in 2011 during the first year of this program. And basically all you need to know here is that the larger and darker a point is on this map, the more tricolored bat calls that were recorded with these driving transects that were done. And so just kind of take a mental inventory here and notice that the largest two categories, like the highest categories, are really a lot of what you see here. And then let's see how that changed. This is 2017. This is right before we went statewide with this program, and those sites kind of changed. And you'll see here, we just really have the smallest two categories represented here and not any of those larger three categories. And so we saw a significant change here in the number of calls that are being picked up in this survey method. So this was a 79% decline over the 7 years of this program. And we've seen even a continued decline since then. So white nose syndrome in the mountains, like I said, we know it's pretty much throughout the mountains, but we still do see a few remaining tricoloreds in hibernacula. So it's pretty rare for us to go in a cave or mine and see no tricoloreds at all. Usually we see, like, even if it's just one, a lot of times it's just, you know, a few, 5 or 8 or something like that. Sometimes as many as like 15 or something like that, but not a whole lot. But that's better than some of our other species have done with white nose. So northern longeareds, to give you some context, we haven't seen in a cave or mine since 2014. Little browns we see in one cave primarily that's left. So it's great that we still do see some tricolored bats, even though it's just a fraction of what we used to have. To give you some more perspective on this, the hibernaculum where we had the highest count in the state of tricoloreds, it's up in the mountains, and we had 3,500 at the highest count before white nose. And this winter it was down to 16 individuals. And so just really super steep declines. And that's been seen in many other places throughout the range, not just North Carolina. So that's what prompted the proposed listing. But some good news here. Every summer we do mist netting surveys. It's not the best tool for tricolored bats specifically because they're really hard to catch. But we caught a female in 2022 and she was lactating. And that's good news because a lot of times, so that means she was nursing pups, presumably at her roost. And that's great news because a lot of times these white nose survivors, even if they're surviving, it doesn't guarantee that they'll reproduce. A lot of times they're just not in the best shape to be able to go through that demanding process of reproduction. So to see that we caught one, so that's survival, and then it's reproducing, that's wonderful. We hope to see more of that. We just haven't seen a lot of that. But again, tricoloreds are really hard to catch in a mist net as well. So a highlight I'd like to share from the mountains, we have one cave where we've got the highest count that we know of in the state for tricoloreds. This is post white nose syndrome, and this year it went up. So it went from about 70 bats previously to this year we had 102 in our count. So we're into triple digits, which is wonderful. Again, just a fraction of what historically we would have had pre-white nose syndrome, but to see the counts go up is at least a big cause for celebration. So we're really excited about that. Moving into the Piedmont now. So here we are in our earlier phases of establishing long-term monitoring. And so we just don't have a whole lot of trend information or trend data for me to share. And for our mist netting, we don't have enough trend data for that right now. And again, I mentioned that's not our best long-term monitoring program for this particular species. It works great for other species, but not these bats as much. Acoustics and hibernacula data are kind of the best for tricoloreds. We're working on acoustic trends. We actually do have enough acoustic data for trends, but we're just actually analyzing it as we speak and trying to crunch those numbers and get those trends out. So stay tuned. We should have that pretty soon. We're just not quite there. But I do have some hibernacula data to share. So this is since 2018. We've been doing hibernacula surveys in the Piedmont since about 2014, but each year from 2014 till about 2018, we were adding new sites. And since 2018, we've kind of locked in our sites. And so we've been kind of continuing with those. So this is from 2018. We surveyed certain sites. We surveyed those same sites in 2019 and in 2022, and we'll do so again this coming winter. And you can see we counted a little over 80 tricolored bats in 2018. It went up a tick in 2019. And then we decided, you know what, we don't need to go to these sites every year. That's a little too much disturbance. So then we backed off and went back again in 2022 and saw, oh, hey, we're up to 140 tricoloreds in these sites. Our count here is going up. It's not going down like we see in the mountains. And so that's really good. Even though we're still in these early phases, we don't have a ton of data here. We are seeing an increase in counts, and that's great news. We're used to seeing a decline. But why is that? Why is white nose different in the Piedmont? Well, we have some hypotheses on this, and one of them is that, we have just warmer winter nights in the Piedmont than we do in the mountains. And so on those warmer winter nights, insects could be active, and so bats could be active foraging on insects. That would be huge if that's happening, which we do think that's happening, because then the bats are able to fight off that white nose syndrome infection, ramp up their immune system, clean themselves off, rebuild those fat reserves so that they hopefully don't starve to death. So that's all really big. And then it's a shorter winter overall. So we know tricoloreds are going to be in hibernation for that entire swath of time. They're the first to go in, they're the last to leave. So a shorter winter is really good for them, in some cases, to have less time to endure the disease and succumb to the disease. And we also see, even though we have 7 positive Piedmont counties as far as where we have found the disease or the fungus, we often see what you see here in this slide. If you can tell, that bat has just like a little speck of white just under its nose. And that's usually what we see as far as fungal growth on these bats. We usually don't see bats just covered in the fungus. A lot of times we just don't see bats with any fungal growth that we can detect with our eyes. And that's very different than in the mountains, where we see pretty much every tricolored bat has some amount of fungus on it, and some of them are just totally covered. But I should say, tricoloreds are less abundant east of the mountains, so Piedmont and coastal plain, than they were in the mountains before white nose syndrome. That was really the stronghold because we have so many caves and mines up there, and this tends to be a hibernating species. So a Piedmont highlight I'd like to share. This was pretty cool. This past winter, we had a stormwater environmental specialist named Tony Victor who wrote into us. He had seen this white nose documentary that we were featured in, and he told us that he does these inspections of underground sand filters, which I admittedly know literally nothing about, but apparently, you know, they're used to run rainwater through to remove pollutants. And there are these underground concrete structures you can walk around in, and he had seen some bats in there, and he let us know about that. And so Olivia Munzer and Brooke Massa went in there this winter to follow up on his report, and lo and behold, there were 5 tricolored bats just hibernating there up where the wall and the ceiling meet, like you can see in this photo here. So it was just a really interesting find, unusual. We didn't even know what a sand filter was. So now we have this report. So this can help us reach out and try to do surveys of some of these other sand filters wherever they exist and see if we can find more bats hibernating in them over the winter. Moving on to the coastal plain. So we, again, just like the Piedmont, are in kind of our long-term monitoring early establishment phases, still getting our feet under us. Not enough data for mist netting trends, even though we are doing some mist netting, and some others in the state are also doing mist netting. We're working on crunching those numbers with the acoustic trends, so bear with us on that. But we do have a little bit of hibernacula data to share with you, with the big caveat. So this is only from one site. So we know like one site is just not enough to hang your hat on. And even more than that, this site is really variable with our counts. And so from about 8 bats at the lowest end up to 22 at the highest end. And the reason for that is just probably weather. So on the coastal plain, these bats don't have to be in hibernation, and we'll kind of get into that here in a minute. But at this cave, we on the coldest days, we see the highest counts. And if it's not super cold, we don't see very many bats in there because they just don't need to be in an underground place like that. They can be in a more exposed roost, like in a tree or something like that. So it's not necessarily concerning to have much variation here. And this is the only cave that we know of on the coastal plain with bats, and we really don't know of many more caves, period, on the coastal plain or underground mines for that matter. So there might be a few more, but there's probably not a lot out there. So we would love to hear if there are more, but that's all we know of at this point. The good news about white nose syndrome in the coastal plain is we don't have any evidence of it. And if it were ever there, if PD were ever introduced, we think the bats would fare okay because it's a warmer winter there, and we know that bats are pretty active and insects are pretty active. And so they are not having this very long-term hibernation like we would see in the mountains, and to a lesser degree in the Piedmont, where they're having to hibernate for months on end. They're more so just going through periods of torpor that could last several days in a row, depending on what the weather is like, but not going to be several months. Again, though, tricoloreds are less abundant here as well than they were in the mountains before white nose syndrome. A highlight I'd like to share with you from the coastal plain. This one I'm pretty excited about. I mean, I'm excited about all of them, but I'm like, we've got more to discover here, and I'm excited about this. So we recently, in 2022, found this old data set. It was over 20 years old, from 2 different students. It's really 2 different data sets. And one was a NC State student, and one was a UNCW student. And they did just a astounding number of bridge surveys for bats in the late 90s and the early 2000s. All told, or all combined, it was about 1,000 bridge surveys. And they found 135 bridges that either had bats or evidence of bats, meaning bat guano. And so I decided, like, maybe we'll just go take a look at some of these bridges as we have time, the ones that had bats or signs of bats, and just see what we find, thinking, oh, it might be neat, but we probably won't find very much. So in May of 2022, we had a couple hours of time to kill. And so we went to 3 of these bridges from this data set that had had bats or signs of bats. And we found, out of those 3 bridges, we found one that had an adult tricolored bat with pups, and it's the bats you see there on the left. And that was a big find because I had never seen a maternity roost of tricolored bats. I'd never seen a mother bat with pups. And so it's just not something you run into very much, because a lot of times they're up in the trees in these leaf clusters and you would never know that they're there. So that was a really cool find. And I thought, wow, this was really useful. With just a few hours of our time checking these 3 bridges, we found a tricolored bat with pups. That's a big one. And so in January, we went back and did some more of these bridge surveys. This time we checked 21, and we found 9 bridges with tricolored bats. And so that was also astounding to me. I didn't think we'd find, I didn't know if we'd find any bats. I mean, it was the winter time. This is still pretty exposed for them to be roosting. But we just didn't know what we'd find. So that was pretty cool to see. And then in May, we checked 23 bridges, and we found 6 of them with tricolored bats. And 3 of those bridges, these bats had pups with them as well, like we had seen in May of 2022. And so this has just been really surprising to see these tricoloreds. And we're learning so much because it's not, the bridges that we're finding them in is not necessarily what I would peg them to be in. They're really short span bridges, like you see in this photo. A lot of times when we find bats in bridges, they're really big concrete bridges because they hold a lot of heat if they're really big and they're concrete. But these small ones, typically we'd write them off. We'd drive right over and not survey them. But that's what we're finding because of these great data sets. And they're also pretty low to the water. And that would also cause us to write them off previously, because we're seeing evidence that these bridges will flood, and we're seeing flood debris just, wedged up in the crevices of these bridges, and the bats are roosting right next to it. So, yeah, we're just learning a lot. Like, these bats can be generalists on things, and we don't really know unless we go and we look for them. So we're going to continue surveys through 2024. And maybe even longer, if it takes us longer to check all of these 135 bridges. But it's just really a unique opportunity to learn about these tricolored bats. So it's pretty exciting. And similarly to bridges, bats are also using, tricolored bats and other bats are using culverts under roadways also. And so we're starting to gather more data on this statewide. So this is not just restricted to the coastal plain. And the reason for this is we're seeing that other states in the Southeast are checking their culverts and finding bats. And so that prompted us to do the same. And we're finding tricoloreds and some other bats in select culverts. So it's definitely not the majority of culverts that you go in. It's very few compared to all the culverts that you survey. A lot of them you walk through or crawl through sometimes and see no bats, but we are sometimes finding these tricoloreds, and so that's pretty cool. We don't know very much at all, though, about like how often they're using them, seasonally, if there are differences, what types of culverts maybe do they have a preference for. So we're kind of still at the beginning phases of gathering the data to understand more about these culvert roosts. Something that we have gotten some data on, which has been kind of cool, in the coastal plain and the Piedmont, where we've gone and we've seen tricoloreds in the winter in these culverts, and then we've come back a few years later in the winter. Most of the time we still see tricoloreds in those same culverts. And so it seems like they are occupying these culverts potentially over multiple winters, kind of like a hibernaculum that they're faithful to. And so this may be playing a critical habitat role during parts of the year, especially where subterranean habitat is limited in, the Piedmont coastal plain specifically. So again, it's something we want to better understand, but it's pretty neat to see that. All right, I want to wrap up with kind of what we're doing and kind of what can be done to help these bats. So we're working with partner agencies. So far, it's been NC State Parks and the U.S. National or the the U.S. Forest Service. Excuse me, my COVID fog brain. We're limiting disturbance to bats at caves and mines by building these bat gates for them. And these are really key because we just want to protect these bats, especially when they're hibernating, because anytime we go in caves and mines, even us, we're well-meaning, we're just trying to do a survey, our body temperature is going to raise that temperature, ambient temperature in the cave or mine, and that pulls bats out of hibernation. It wakes them up. They have no choice because they're matching their body temperature to the temperature in the space. And we don't want to wake them up any extra because, as we talked about, they're waking up a lot anyway from white nose, and that's usually what causes them to not make it. So we just want to prevent any unauthorized entry into caves and mines where we still have these tricolored bats. And we also, this can help to minimize the spread of those fungal spores that causes white nose syndrome as well. So this is something we've been working really hard on every year for the past few years. We've been installing a few more of these. We're also really working on building that long-term monitoring data set statewide. Like I said, we've got a good data set in the mountains. We're working on the Piedmont and the coastal plain. Takes a lot of work, but we're getting there with it. And as we go, we're also keying in on targeted sites as well, especially bridges and culverts, because we're finding some tricolors in those, but also just looking for new sites, especially caves and mines too. So we're always on the hunt for these things. So yeah, anytime we get any word about tricolors or pictures or anything, we're trying to track those down and key in on new target sites. We also recently participated in a research project done by Bat Conservation International called the Fat Bat Project, which could have some great management implications. The premise of this project is that, there's been work to show that fatter bats have a better chance of surviving the winter with white nose infection, which makes sense because they can deplete their fat reserves because of white nose. So if they go into hibernation fatter, the hope is that they can make it through to the other side to coming out in the spring and not starve to death. And so the goal of this is to put a UV light outside of a cave or mine in the fall that draws in a big insect buffet for bats. And so they can really fatten up before they go into hibernation. And then you put that UV light back out in the springtime so that these bats, as they come out of hibernation, they're presumably weak and sick from white nose, but they can ramp back up their immune system and get healthier and speed their recovery by being able to eat really easily and not have to fly far and wide for these insects. So we're waiting for the final results from Bat Conservation International, but that might be something that we could actually implement at some key sites if it seems like it's going to be useful. So how can we all help these tricolored bats? A big one is, like I said, we're always looking for more sites, and caves and mines are really our best place to do population monitoring for these bats. And so if you know of caves and mines, if you hear of cave and mines, if you find one, please let me know, and we can add that to our survey list. And then on this, along the same lines, kind of, if you know of caves and mines or of folks that go into caves and mines, just please tell folks to avoid going in there in the wintertime. That just allows these bats to be undisturbed, to not be waking up needlessly. They need to not be waking up any extra times than they're already going to be waking up with a white nose infection. Another one, as far as forest management goes, is to avoid tree clearing during the pup season if possible. So in North Carolina, we define that from the start of May to the end of July, but that we can narrow that down based on where you specifically are. It's a little earlier in that time frame on the coastal plain, and then near the kind of later parts of that time frame as you go westward in the state. And the reason for this is because pups are going to be flightless for the first several weeks of life. And so any threats that could come to them, they can't fly away like they would if they were mature enough. And so they can't avoid the threat. So if a tree is going down, they're going down with it. And then prescribed fire, kind of along the same lines, if it can be avoided during that pup season, that's probably the gold standard. I know that's really tough though when you're managing timeframes for other species as well. And so if it can't be avoided during the pup season, a low intensity burn is going to be better, just so that those flames aren't getting so high, it's not getting so hot for these flightless pups. Some more kind of how you can help topics here. If you're doing some timber harvesting, retaining those largest live trees is going to be really helpful for these bats. So a lot of you may be used to thinking about snags for bats or dead trees for bats, which are great for many of our other species. Tricolored bats don't tend to use those, though. They tend to use the live trees, and the larger ones are going to get more solar exposure and be nice and warm for them. So those are the ones that you want to try to leave if you can. And then, this is good for a multitude of reasons, but just retaining and conserving a riparian buffer is going to be great for these bats because they are going to be kind of more tied to these riparian areas. And a lot of times we see bats flying along the banks, kind of within the shade and protection of the trees. That helps them not be avoided or not be picked up by predators like owls and things like that. So that's just going to be a really good thing, really for a lot of reasons too. And then creating additional edge habitat when you're doing some forest management can be a great thing for these bats. They are going to be kind of an edge specialist. They'll key in on that edge. A lot of our other bat species do as well. And they'll also use small forest openings for foraging as well. So those are great things for these bats. And then as far as management goes as well, you want to limit it when you can in proximity to a hibernaculum. And that's in the fall and in the spring. And the reason for that is these bats, they will move to their winter grounds in the fall, and they'll kind of just set up shop in the area around that cave or mine that they're going to be hibernating in. For several weeks, they'll just be in those forests foraging, trying to fatten up, and we don't want any other stressor for them. We want them to be as healthy as they can be going into hibernation so they could survive white nose. And then when they come out in the spring, they're going to kind of stage in that same area, that nearby forest to their hibernaculum for several weeks before they go to their summer grounds. And again, we just don't want to tax them anymore while they're recovering from a white nose infection. And then just a big one is always planting native species when you can. This is really going to help draw in native insects, and that's just a really great thing for our bats to feed on. So that's what I've got for you today. I'm happy to take questions. And one more little plug. Our work was featured in this White Nose documentary last year. It's called In Echo All About. It's freely available on Vimeo. It's 40 minutes long, and it goes into a lot more of what I didn't get to today and talking about other bat species as well. So if this was interesting to you, I would recommend checking that out. You can just Google the title and it should come up. All right. I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Thanks, Catherine. That was a great talk. So if you want to ask a question, pop it in the chat and I will ask Catherine those questions. I have one. because I know nothing about bats and I definitely don't know anything about white nose syndrome. Uh, what was the original vector that brought white nose from Europe, Asia over to North America? Do we know?
Yeah, great question. So the exact smoking gun has never been figured out, like with many things like this, but it first showed up in New York State in a cave, a very popular like tourist cave called Howell's Cave in 2006. And so the thought is someone was caving in Europe and Asia or visiting a cave and didn't know, but they inadvertently brought the spores on maybe their footwear or their caving gear over into Howell's Cave, since that's a popular cave. These spores are really hardy and they're microscopic. And what I didn't say is this disease wasn't known until it showed up in New York. And so this person who brought it over, we think, like whoever it could have been, had no way of knowing because we didn't even know white nose syndrome was a thing. It
Yeah.
doesn't affect bats in Europe and Asia the way it affects our bats. We don't see big mortalities. We don't see all this fungal growth. And so it just wasn't known until it showed up in 2006 in New York. And since then, scientists went over to be like, where did this come from? How did this happen? And that's when taking fungal swabs, it was found in Europe and Asia as well. And the thinking is that a very long time ago, it wasn't even recorded that this could have happened over there. And now these are many generations later, the survivors, offspring, basically. And there's a lot less diversity and abundance over there than we formerly had here in the US.
Okay. My last question from me is, so I'm sure this has been thought about, but is there any treatment for the bats? Is there any treatment for the caves? I know caves can be quite large, but is there something you can do to lessen the white nose bacteria or
Yeah,
fungus?
so there's a whole lot of trials going on to figure out in the lab and in the field what we can do to eradicate this fungus. And it's actually not that hard of a fungus to kill, but the problem is it's such a nuanced kind of issue. So, we've got non-target fungi in caves, naturally occurring beneficial fungi. We don't want to wipe those out. And then just, yeah, like you said, caves and mines, they can be so different in the volume of the cave and complexity. And so some of these treatments require you to hand deliver it to the bats and put something on the bats. And bats can be, hundreds of feet up above away from you. And so that can be problematic. Some of these you can have like an aerosol exposure, so that's possible. But really, a lot of the research shows you've got to get into caves and mines either before white nose gets there or right at the onset, and then you've got to treat them in perpetuity. So, it's might not be possible. So, the fat bat idea is one I personally like because I feel like it's something we could actually do.
Mhm.
We've, had this big population crash, so we're not at the onset, but we could support our survivors, and it would be relatively cheap for us, to just set up this equipment, these UV lights, take them down. But yeah, there's nothing commercially available at this point as far as treatment goes.
Okay. Sorry for that. Um, hold on a second. Sorry for that.
No problem.
One question was, doesn't DOT have bridge inspectors, and why not ask them to report any bats they see?
Yeah, great question. Yep, so DOT does have bridge inspectors, and we do get some data from DOT, which is wonderful. So there are like multiple of us trying to work on this and figure out where bats are on bridges. But it's just, those inspectors, they have like a long, long list of things they're looking for, and a lot of them are super time consuming, looking at cracks on, different structures on the bridge. And so sometimes we don't get maybe a really detailed report of what they saw about bats, but they might say bats, or bat poop or something, and that gives us a starting point to check back into. But it's also unfortunately not something we have as much time for as we would want to, because this is one of our species and we got 16 others too, and so it's just tough with all these bats trying to get out there and get as much info as we can. But yeah, bridges are a good place for many bats to look for. We just don't always get as many of those bridge surveys done a year as we can.
Good. The next question is, what is the trade-off between increased food from a new opening versus loss due to harvest during pup season?
Yeah, so that would be really hard to quantify, but in general, new openings are really good for many species of bats because it does bring in a lot of insects. And just having a less airspace for them to fly through, while not being a giant opening. Some of our bats are not going to use giant openings, so smaller ones are better because more species will use those. They'll feel safer flying in those than a really big opening. But yeah, forest management that creates openings is really beneficial to bats, but it's hard to say, yeah, the trade-off of like bats that don't make it because of a fallen tree and their pups that are flightless versus the food source. It's just we haven't had any studies that have looked at that, but it would be really nice to have some better numbers on that.
Okay. And I think the last question that I have so far is, does the white nose syndrome fungus ever die? Which I think you answered that, but I'll let you answer it again.
Yeah, unfortunately, it does not. So once it's established at a site, it stays there. And so it's something that we have to be really mindful of going in caves and mines because we go to all the places the bats go. And so we could be really spreading it if we're not careful. So we go to great lengths to decontaminate all of our gear, our truck, ourselves. After every survey, we're decontaminating stuff because we don't want to spread that fungus. Um, and so, yeah, it just sticks around. Yep.
And one more popped up. Can you discuss any cooperation from licensed wildlife control agents that do bat work in reporting detections or monitoring efforts?
Yeah, so that's this great resource that we have because these wildlife control agents are out there doing this work with bats and getting all this data. So that's something we're actually trying to tap more into is getting some on the ground reports from wildlife control agents and sort of working with them more to say, here's what we're looking for. If you see this, can you let us know? And so that's something that's sort of still in its infancy, but we just sent out a few emails a couple weeks ago, specifically looking at little brown bats, so not tricolors. But I've already gotten some text messages from wildlife control agents showing me pictures of bats or poop, and that's great. That's exactly what we need. Any way we can get more data from other people who are out there anyway is great for us.
All right, that seems to be all the questions. Thank you, Catherine, so much. That was a great presentation. And once again, as always, this has been recorded. It'll eventually go on our YouTube page for the Wildlife Commission and on our website. And you'll be able to share that with folks that want to learn more about tricolored bats or bats in general in North Carolina. We will see you in November. Heather will send out an invite for the November presentation at some point. And thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me.